The Still Loading podcast is brought to you by the wonderful people on Patreon. Amazing people like Charles M., Stephen P., Mr. Biscuits, Gilmer, Kevin from the Bit by Bit Foundation, and Eric H. have been wonderful enough to support the show over on Patreon. So if you would also like to get your name read at the beginning of the episode, along with a bunch of other goodies, go over to patreon.com/stillloadingpod and check out everything it has to offer. On this episode of Still Loading, Puff Puff 2, The Puffining. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval. Today's episode is episode 2 of Toriyama month. We are covering Dragon Quest II, which was later called Dragon Quest II Luminaries of the Legendary Lion, a very alliterative subtitle for this game. So Dragon Quest II, joining me to talk about all things dragons and quests as we quest our way through this Dragon Warrior game is my good buddy Try from, of course, as you know, My Life in Gaming. Try, how are you doing today?
Doing great. I am excited to talk some Dragon Quest.
I was a little nervous trying to find a guest for this episode because Dragon Quest II is not, from what I've understood from other people, not a well-received game in the series. But when I mentioned that I was doing this, you mentioned you're a big fan of Dragon Quest II. So I was so happy that you said that. I'm like, oh, thank God, someone who likes this game to balance out some of the things. And I'm going to, spoiler alert for my opinion on this, I was not a big fan of this game. I would say about, just before we get into it in depth, I would say about the first half of the game I really enjoyed, and then the second half just kind of turned me off. And we'll get to all the reasons why in just a moment. But yeah, so Try, thank you once again for joining me. I guess to kick it off though, why Dragon Warrior 2? Why Dragon Quest 2? Excuse me. It was Dragon Warrior over here in North America for a while, but why Dragon Quest 2? Like, what about this game has appealed to you and you still have fond memories of it all these years later?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, you know, whether it really should or should not. I would say that for me personally, like, expectations being exceeded or, you know, not met can have kind of a disproportionate result on my feelings toward a game. And Dragon Quest 2, like you kind of alluded to, not really a fan favorite, I would say. And I was not a big fan of Dragon Warrior 1.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, I respect it. I respect the heck out of it. I love so much of what it stands for and what it tried to do, but the end result was a game that was just mostly nothing but grinding, at least the way I approached it. And granted, I was playing the NES version. But to back up even further, I had Dragon Warrior 1 for a pretty long time. You know, when I started rebuilding my NES collection, I'm like, well, this is an iconic game. It's common, it's cheap, I'm going to buy it. But I never really delved deep into it.
Okay.
And then I would say a couple of years after Dragon Warrior, they were still calling it Dragon Warrior 7 when that came to the PlayStation. That was the last one to be called Dragon Warrior in the US. I got a used copy of that, and I almost started it the summer between 2 years in college. I can't remember exactly which summer it was. I almost started it. I think it was between my freshman and sophomore years. And then a friend of mine challenged me to, he was like, oh man, like I beat Final Fantasy 7 in like 5 days. Like, can you do better than that? And I was like literally like on
Fuck yeah, I can.
I was on the title screen for Dragon. Like I was like thinking, what am I going to name my character? And my friend sends me this instant message. And I'm like, oh, I can do better in 5 days in Final Fantasy 7. Just you watch. Um, and yeah, so I didn't get back to Dragon Quest 7 was derailed for yet another run through Final Fantasy 7. Go figure. In retrospect, though, I'm glad I did not play Dragon Quest VII then because I feel it may have turned me off from the series because the only two Dragon Quest games I had at that time were 1 and 7.
Huh,
And
okay.
those are maybe my least favorite ones. Um, and so I'm glad I waited until Dragon Quest 8 came to PlayStation 2, completely fell in love with it. I mean, I was just like, wow, this feels like an NES game, but on the PS2, and it's like the best kind of NES game. Like you could just really see how, the core of it was so simple and so pure, but so good that it didn't need to really reinvent itself, right?
Mhm.
It just the sense of exploring the world and the sense of danger out there. I loved it. It really resonated with me. Fell in love with it. So yeah, then I was like, okay, let's get into the series. And then I played Dragon Warrior 1, and I'm like, oof, I don't know about these NES Dragon Quests. So what's funny is I was thinking about it, and in a lot of ways, like Dragon Warrior 2 is kind of like a key game in like what my game collection has become.
Hmm.
Because I was like, kind of like, I don't know if Dragon Warrior 2 is that big of a priority after people were telling me, oh, it's pretty much, if you didn't like Dragon Warrior 1, Dragon Warrior 2 is pretty much the same thing, except you've got two other party members. You're probably not going to like it. And
Huh.
so I wasn't really thinking that much about getting it. But the very first game convention that I ever went to was MagFest, just kind of like outside of Washington, D.C.
Yeah, yeah.
And it in in retrospect, MagFest is actually a terrible convention for like game hunting. I haven't been in a long time, but uh, this was, I would say, it had to have been 2012. I'm pretty positive, or no, 2013. It was 2013. It was 2013. First game convention I'd ever been to. I hadn't really looked for like local game stores because, like, after GameStop bought FuncoLand and GameStop stopped selling NES games, like I just didn't know there were stores that still sold like NES games and Super Nintendo games in the
Mhm.
early 2000s. I just thought that wasn't a thing anymore. If you wanted those games, you bought them on eBay. And I would buy like an NES, like one or two NES games a year on eBay, something I really wanted. But I got this like huge rush of dopamine. Like, just think about it. This is my first convention. I have not like seen just like boxes and boxes and boxes of NES games like out
Yeah.
for sale in
Mhm.
maybe a decade. And this is just filling me with like euphoric feelings of like, oh my gosh, I'm looking through NES games to buy again. This
I'm
is great.
amongst
This
my
is
people.
crazy. Yes, yes, it was, oh man, I was like, this is living. This is living. Uh, And ever since then, like, I was like, oh, I gotta look for like local game stores that I can go get this experience again. Like, I want to shop for NES games again. Yes, this is great. But anyway, I don't I didn't buy like a lot of games. I know I know I bought only a couple, maybe three or four, but the only one I very specifically remember getting at that first MagFest was Dragon Warrior 2. I think it was like $20.
Mm, yeah.
And that kind of kick-started, I would say, like a new phase of like game collecting for me, right? Because like I'm
Mhm.
like, I can do this in person again. Wow. But I was like, do I really want this? But it was like, it was right there. It was a clean copy. I was like, just caught up in the euphoria of the game shopping. I buy it. And I'm kind of like, I don't know if I'm really going to like this, but I'm going to give it a shot. And like I said, expectations, whether this should be the case or not, like if I go into a game with middling expectations and it really surprises me that it's a lot better than I expected, like that alone increases my opinion of the game even further. And
Yeah.
I'm
I
like, oh
can
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah, the
can
game was,
understand that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people be like, "Oh, you should be able to be more objective and separate your thoughts
No,
from
that's
that." And it's
the
like,
whole point of reviewing a game is putting your subjective opinion on it. You
yeah,
try to be objective. Well, objectivity is literally just finding valid is a loose term, and it could be a dangerous slope if you try to quantify it. But like, if you have a good reason for why your opinions are the way they are, and even if you don't, you can just say, I don't know why I like this, but I like this. Like it's fine. Like I don't know. People There's no such thing as objectivity when it comes to reviewing media. The whole point of reviewing media is that you have a subjective take on it. So it's always
yeah,
weird to me when
yeah,
people get on that. Anyway,
yeah.
I
So
totally
so
understand
yeah,
that
I
though.
I did I did play through it, and I was, I mean, maybe you didn't really have. It sounds like our perception of the first Dragon Warrior slash Quest was a little different, and maybe I just approached it with the wrong mindset. But to me, the first game felt very much like, okay, this town has, I don't know, it looks like a good sword, good shield, good armor. All right, I don't have to have enough money to buy it, so I'm just gonna go in circles until I can buy it. And then it's like, okay, now I'm stronger. I've got better weapon, better armor, more levels. Okay, let's see where I can go now. Well, there's not much to do except go to this town. Oh, okay, and then this town has better weapons, better armor. Well, I'll walk in circles until I have enough money to buy that. And there were
Hmm.
like some overarching objectives for the game, and I do appreciate how, very little, there is like kind of that key moment with the princess, but like for the most part, like not a lot of progress is gated by like story events, which is something I really appreciate. You're just like set out there in the world and you find your way. And I love the idea of that. But in practice, for me, it was just a lot of grinding.
Hmm.
Um, Whereas Dragon Quest 2 felt much more like there were all of the I was able to, I was telling you, I wrote notes while I was playing the game, and most NPCs, aren't just talking about like, well, I hope my
The
turnips
weather or
turn out all
something.
right this season.
Yeah.
It's not world building type stuff or, inane chatter. Some of it might be, but largely it is useful gameplay information. Oh, I heard this thing doesn't like this kind of magic. I heard that this tower over here, that this is over to the west, this is to the south. I heard a rumor about this and that. And of course, all rumors are true. You write that stuff down, you scratch it off as you follow up on it. I felt like I had a pretty steady stream of things like, wow, look at all these things that I've written down that I can investigate. And maybe I would have found a similar experience with Dragon Warrior 1 if I had done that. I don't know. But it felt like I was always investigating something new that was pushing the game forward in some way. And to me, I think a lot of people, when they approach an old RPG, they call people have a very low threshold for declaring, oh, this game is grindy. And I think a lot of it could be that they are following a guide, perhaps. They know where they need to go. They know that this is coming up. Maybe the guide even says something like, like, oh, you should be level 27 before you fight this boss. And then they don't really like question it for
Yeah.
themselves. And so they're like, well, I guess I got to grind, or I know where to go. So therefore, you cut out the exploration side of it and
Hmm.
you end up being too weak, and then you have to walk in circles. But from my perspective, if you're walking in circles with the explicit intent of doing nothing but fighting monsters to get experience and money and other drops from them, that's grinding. But if you are exploring and trying to find out where to go, and you just, the monsters you fight along the way in pursuit of that, that to me is not grinding. And so there was,
I'd agree with that.
so for
I'd agree with
me,
that.
even if I got into a dungeon where I'm like, whoa, I'm not powerful enough for these monsters, or I get to like the second room and I'm like, I'm going to have to retreat and run back to town and try it again. Like to me, I'm still pushing forward. I'm still trying to make progress. And even though ultimately the same result could have been gained by walking in circles before going into the tower the first time and failing, to me that process wasn't grinding. So maybe I would have found a similar experience with Dragon Quest One if I had approached it a little differently and paid more attention to what NPC said and wrote down the notes. Because I mean that's something I love about this era of RPGs, is because you do need to pay attention, and NPCs become part of the gameplay, not just part of the world building. And I maybe didn't really understand that at the time I played Dragon Quest One, but anyway, I guess I've rambled on enough. But I found it to be a very fulfilling RPG experience up until, I will concede, the last couple of areas are kind of garbage and pretty infamous. But
Yeah,
up
and
to
there's
that point,
reasons for that.
up to that point, I think it's really excellent, and I overall walked away with a very positive impression. But yes, things do change, and like I wouldn't say latter half so much, but like latter quarter, latter fifth, maybe.
I getcha.
Yeah,
I
it,
getcha.
it takes a nosedive for sure. Don't get me wrong, but on the whole, I had a very positive experience, and I also freaking love main characters in RPGs with goggles. I mean, come on.
With goggles.
Goggles on RPG Hero are so cool.
Does your main character wear goggles?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the Japanese box art, he totally wears
Oh.
goggles. So does the Prince of Cannock.
All right, I'll have to look into that. Now, real quick, because there's so many things I want to jump off on that you brought up so many really interesting and good points. For my own experience, this was once again like the previous game. I played it for the first time for this show, and one thing you brought up, there's actually two things you brought up that I want to touch on here, and we can use that as a good stepping stone because my experience is none. There's not a big story for this. Like you had this really interesting story how you got back into collecting, which this was the first game that you associate with getting back into collecting, which is really cool. Me, it's just I played it for the show. Like I don't even have a physical copy of it. I downloaded ROM and I beat it within 24 hours. I swear it. I deleted it like a good boy. But for me, what you mentioned before about expectations and how depending on what expectations you have of a game going into it can either make or break a game. And I'm in complete agreement with you on that because Dragon Quest One, I went into with very low expectations. I was expecting a grindy experience, an experience where I'm going to have to do lots of fighting, lots of old JRPG jank, and while there was some of that, and listeners will know what I said at the the previous episode. What honestly sold it for me was how refreshingly straightforward it was. I really liked its simplicity. I liked how there wasn't any fluff to it. It was a very lean experience, and I really enjoyed that. So going into Dragon Quest 2, I'm like, oh man, this is going to be so good. I really liked 1. I can't wait to see what 2 has to offer. And 2 just, it had all the promise. It set itself up so interestingly. Like I liked how they took the simple story of the first game, expanded it just a little bit, and the I shouldn't say the legacy, the reputation that I gather of Dragon Quest is that there's very small incremental changes in the series. It's not like Final Fantasy where like almost every game is like an entirely new game. Dragon Quest, there's they all feel kind of similar, and there's small incremental changes to the core mechanics, and that's what this was. This was a really Dragon Quest 2 was a really interesting step forward for the industry, excuse me, for the series in many different ways, which we'll get to the differences between 1 and 2 in just a moment. But I went into it with all of these high hopes, and I left it just being frustrated. And the other thing you brought up about grinding, that's the issue I'm having right now with Dragon Quest 3, which at the time of recording this, I actually tweeted out where I'm like, I'm calling my playthrough of it. I'm so done with the game. After hearing what you said, I may go back and just try to tough it out for a little bit and then go from there, because I'm close to the end. I'm right at the time we're recording this. I'm right before. Actually, no, I can't say anything because I don't want to spoil. There seems to be a decent spoiler in that game, so I don't want to spoil it just yet.
Mm.
But so I'll keep it there. But I'm getting close to the end. I'm probably well over. I'm probably like 2/3 of the way through, maybe a little more, maybe 3/4. In any case, um, so with Dragon Quest 2, I had all these high hopes, and then it just did not meet them. I was very frustrated by this game, and we'll get into all the reasons why. And I want to kick off this conversation with just the setup for this game. How does this game start off in terms of like why are we going on this grand adventure? The first game is because you want to stop the Dragon Lord and return light to the world, to Alefgard. Um, in Dragon Quest 2, you play as the descendants of the character from the first game, and there's this new big bad named Hargon who wants to basically, once again, same thing as Dragonlord. He just wants to take over the world, and
That
just kind
that
of
that's a
fill it with
theme.
monsters. Yeah, just a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Now, I found it funny though. The prologue, both on the NES, and I played the Super Famicom fan translation of it. They have a little text crawl in the Super Famicom version. The text fade, at least in the fan translation I played, the text fades in and out before it gets to the opening cutscene. Uh, I'm going to read the original NES one, and then I'm going to read you the fan translation one, and uh, some of my thoughts on it. So the original NES one, it reads, "Many years ago, a young warrior who was of the line of the great Erdrick came to Alefgard and defeated the dreaded Dragonlord, restoring peace to the land. For many generations, the descendants of that warrior ruled Alefgard and the surrounding lands, including the kingdom of Moonbrook across the eastern sea from Alefgard." That's the NES prologue, right? The Super Famicom fan translation goes, "Ages ago, a young descendant of the legendary warrior Erdrick defeated the Dragonlord and returned light to the world." That's a pretty good synopsis of what we saw in the NES one, right? A little less wordy, but same thing. Descendant of Erdrick defeats Dragonlord, returns light to the world.
Sure.
This next paragraph, these next two paragraphs, is where it kind of goes off the rails, in my opinion. "The young man, together with his bride," which is not mentioned in the first one, but in the NES one, but that is the princess that you meet that you rescue at the end of the first game. The young man, together with his bride, left on a journey to build several new countries. These countries were ruled by the children of that young couple and were handed down to the following generation. So they're all saying the same thing, basically. In the NES version, it just says, "For many generations, the descendants of that warrior ruled Alefgard," right? And the surrounding areas. Same basic premise. The way the fan translation makes it sound, though, is that they left on a journey to build several new countries, which in my mind just read as they were just having lots of sex across the countryside and just dropping kids everywhere. Just
Okay, you set up a kingdom, and then you set up a kingdom, and you
pretty,
set
you
up a
all get kingdoms. They were pulling an Oprah and just giving all their kids kingdoms.
kingdom.
And here's the thing too, the game takes place. Dragon Quest II takes place 100 years after the events of the first game, right?
Mhm.
There are not that many generations in 100 years.
Yeah,
Okay,
games love to do 100 years. Uh, I've always had a hard time with that. Like, I want to say, like, uh, Wind Waker was supposed to be like 100 years after Ocarina of Time or something. I could be wrong on that, but something like that. I think and it's like I feel like all of this like history and knowledge and stuff like wouldn't have gotten that lost in 100 years.
no, that's literally like literally. If you think, let's say the warrior from the first game was, let's say 25, right? That's a you would assume like a young warrior.
He's probably 16. It's a Japanese RPG.
Yeah.
Let's be
Okay.
real.
So even better. If it's a JRPG, right? Yeah, you're right. He's probably a teenager. Most people live to their like if you're like that well taken care of, you're, let's say you even live to your 60s, right? You're a king. You get all the best treatment in this medieval world. That's still half a century. So you're telling me that him and the princess fucked all around the kingdom, had a bunch of kids. Who knows how those kids are having kids, because they don't tell you if they mingle, if there's people there before. They said they discovered kingdoms and built several new countries. To the way I read that is that it was a wasteland and they just freaking like knowed it and just
Yeah,
repopulated the world.
sounds a little awkwardly worded here, perhaps.
I guess so. Even in the original NES one, though, for many generations, the descendants of that warrior ruled Alefgard and the surrounding lands. That you could at least make the argument that, like, they didn't just completely repopulate the world. But even so, that means they just went around the world having sex a bunch, dropping kids off at different kingdoms, and were like, you take this over now. You get this now. Uh, and so realistically, if that's the case, the the parents of the characters you're playing as in this game were the kids or the grandkids of the hero of Erdrick, right? Like they would have theoretically known them,
Yeah,
assuming
so I,
they
I
were.
guess the princes of Middenhall, Cannock, and the Princess of Moonbrook are like cousins, I guess.
They're all supposed to be cousins, and also,
I never really
actually that
thought of
makes
it
it
that
even
way.
worse. If they're cousins, then their parents are the direct descendants. Like they, like, your hero and the princess had like three kids, probably more, three kids. They started kingdoms, and then they had kids, and those are your heroes. So like like if they're all cousins, I think they even list them as cousins. So if they're all supposed to be cousins, that means their grandparents are the heroes of the first game. So it's not many generations, it's one goddamn generation. Maybe two. I was laughing
Yeah, I
pretty
don't
hard
know.
when I
Video
read
games
that.
really do seem to act like, oh, 100 years is a long time, and
It's not. It's
it's
really not.
really not that long. Like, yeah, like you need to have like a minimum of like 200, 300 years, I think, really, for like just something so totally different to have come out of it.
I mean, not to spoil it, I mean, not to really go into what is going to be talked about in the Chrono Trigger episode at the end of Toriyama month, but if you think about it, you start out in 1000 AD and go back to 600 AD. That's 400
Yeah,
years. That's a good amount of time.
yeah.
There's a couple generations in those 400 years. There is not enough time in a 100-year span for
No,
people to fucking
no.
forget all of this thing and make it sound like it was some crazy story from a bygone era.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, it just that amused me. Now, and to be clear, listeners, I was not mad about any of this. I just found it more amusing. It didn't ruin. This was not what made me upset at this game. It was just something I found amusing. But the whole plot of this game is just fighting Hargon. That's it. You have to defeat Hargon and bring peace to the world again. There's not going to be a spoiler wall for this game, y'all. Like that's the story. Like there's no
Yep.
plot twist. There's no character development. Once again, your main character, you can name whatever you want. I named mine Karas once again, based off that anime. But Try, I want to ask you, what do you name your character in Dragon Quest usually?
I always name my Dragon Quest character Cobalt. Uh,
Cobalt, okay,
yeah.
like the material that's in almost every crafting section of
Well,
an RPG.
Well, that was like kind of the like so the origin of that name, which I use it in Dragon Quest and Pokemon, and sometimes in other games. But the origin of it is when RPG Maker came out on the PS1. I was like super hyped for that. I was like, oh man, like make your own RPG, like yeah. And me and a friend, like we're keeping like these notebooks where we were writing down like all our ideas for our RPGs, and we wouldn't let each other see them, because we wanted to surprise each other with our RPGs that we ultimately never finished, of course.
Of
Um,
course.
yeah, but my main character in my RPG was Cobalt, and I got the idea from I was just bored in science class and looking at the periodic table. I'm like, Cobalt. That sounds like a name. I'll
Mhm.
make my main character Cobalt, and I never finished the game. And then when I started Final Fantasy 11 on PS2, uh, I was like, oh, I'll revive that old name Cobalt for my character in this game. And it wouldn't, I guess Cobalt with a C was taken. So then I tried Cobalt with a K and it worked. So now it's become Cobalt with a K, like the Tool brand, which I didn't know about at the time. Like, you ever see like the
Mhm.
Kobalt
Yep, I
tools,
know what you're
Cobalt
talking
tools?
about.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, not what it is inspired by, but yeah, I'm always Cobalt in Dragon Quest, and yeah, I think what you're working up to is that what I don't exactly know how it works, but what you name your character shuffles some deck of some kind and has a result on what your allies are called. Is that right?
I don't know. I believe so. Do you remember what your allies were named by any chance?
My Prince of Cannock was Artho,
Oh,
and
okay.
my Princess of Moonbrook was Ilani.
It seems like there that's interesting. So mine, I don't know. Once again, I played a fan translation. My Prince of Cannock was Rolando,
I think I've seen that one before. Yeah.
and the Princess of Moonbrook was Linda.
Fun bit of extraneous trivia. Fortune Street on the Wii, right? Um, which Yuji Horii, creator of Dragon Quest, has like this other like series that's like it's basically like a more advanced Monopoly, called
Okay.
Itadaki Street. And it goes back to the Famicom, and it's been quite a while since there's been a new entry. I think the last one was on like early PS4, but the only one that came to the US, they called it Fortune Street, and it came to the
Huh.
Wii, and uh, often these games usually have like they usually have like some guest characters. They always have Dragon Quest characters. Uh, on PS2, they had like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest characters together. And they did that on PS4 as well. But on the Wii, it was Mario characters and
Mm.
Mii's and Dragon Quest characters. And the Princess of Moonbrook is a character, a playable character in Fortune Street on the Wii, and her
Oh.
name is Princessa.
Come on. They're not even trying.
Princessa.
Come on, man. You could have done so much better. That's really funny though.
I have no idea if that's like actually considered like as close
Like
to a canon name as she has. I don't know. But yeah, I it was Artho and Ilani for me.
I like Princessa more than Linda. Linda is just so anticlimactic for a fantasy game that that's like naming your high fantasy character. You're about to go fight orcs and demons and zombies, and your character's name is Bill or something. You know what you know what I mean? There's something underwhelming about that. I found that amusing. Yeah, so that's the setup. That's the setup for the game. Defeating Hargon. There you go. To get into the gameplay, though, I want to talk about what changed between Dragon Quest 1 and 2. And there's lots of changes, and I'm not going to say that I'm covering all of them here. I'm sure there's a bunch that I'm missing, but just here are some of the big changes, and also some of the things that some of the ones I found interesting. First big change, there are three characters as opposed to one. In the first game, for those who remember the last episode, you only play as the hero. That's it. It's one on one, mano e mano, you and a singular monster, and that's it. In this game, there are three characters, and they all have different abilities. You as the hero have no magic, but you can do nothing but straight attacks. Your Prince of Cannock, whatever they name him, you were the prince of a town called Maidenhall. Um, for me, it was Rolando, the Prince of Cannock. He can also do a decent amount of damage, but he also has the ability to use magic. And then your Princess of Moonbrook is pretty much your mage. She can heal. She can do more like attack magic, that kind of stuff. And actually, real quick, because I forgot to include this in the setup to the game, there is an opening cutscene to this game involving the Princess of Moonbrook, and it's pretty brutal
It's
considering that this is an NES game.
yeah,
She basically, you're in the castle of Moonbrook, and the princess is talking with her father, having a conversation with her father, only to have Hargon attack it and have her father burn alive in front of her, and she escapes. But you find out later on she is cursed, and you have to break the curse in order for her to join your party. But that, I'll be honest, like as much as I ended up having issues with this game, that hooked me in right away. I don't know what it was. I was just so surprised to see how like hard this game went right off the bat. Like the
yeah,
first game was so like chill for the most part. Like, oh, the Dragon Lord's a piece of shit, but you go fight him. It's all good. This one, Hargon burns somebody alive, and I mean, he didn't know that she was watching, but the game still shows that to you. The king burns alive in little NES graphics right in front of his daughter. It's pretty
yeah.
messed up.
And ultimately a guard from Moonbrook like stumbles over to Middenhall and
Hmm.
informs the king, and that's how you begin on your quest as the prince. But something that I did just before we recorded, I wanted to check actually if because the NES version has a pretty cool title screen. It's got uh, the three characters like slowly walking toward the screen in a cave, and their torches light up the space around them. It's a little stilted and staged, but it's neat. But it doesn't look especially Japanese, I would say. It doesn't look especially on brand if you look at like the Toriyama characters. So I was like, I want to check if that's in the Japanese Famicom version. Um because I was like, I feel like it's not, and it isn't. It's just got blue title screen with the Dragon Quest logo. But what surprised me more was when I started a new game on my Famicom cartridge, you enter your character's name, and then it just starts with I wasn't reading the text. I can't read Japanese very well, but it starts with like a soldier coming into the throne room in Middenhall saying something. I assume that's the soldier from Moonbrook, probably giving you a very brief summary of what happens. So, what's interesting is that they did seem to make that intro for the NES overseas release, and then they
Huh.
retained that for the Super Famicom version, which is not dissimilar to some nice additions that they did for the American version of Dragon Warrior 1, where the original Famicom version NPCs only face one. Have you ever seen this? Like, NPCs face one direction. They only face forward. You and NPCs, like, no matter what direction you're walking, you are facing forward. uh,
Mhm.
like facing the screen. It's really awkward and unsettling and looks bad. And you know, they redid the sprites for the American version, thankfully. So yeah, they
Okay.
did sort of do some slight upgrades on these games that did carry over to the Super Famicom versions.
Well, and
But yeah, I was surprised by the lack of intro there.
and notably in the Famicom version, before it came over to the NES, there was no battery backup. You had to play with passwords. It was a password save system in the original
Oh,
Famicom version of this game. When came over to North America on the NES, it has the battery backup so you can save. But on the original Famicom, they did not have that. So there's a number of things that were like are like not arguably like objectively worse in the
yeah,
Japanese version of the game.
absolutely.
It's wild. Yeah, so back to the differences. Now that because I totally forgot to mention about that intro cutscene, and back to the differences. As opposed to one character, now you have three. You have all the different characters that we mentioned, and likewise, because you have more than one character that you can play with, you also get. You also fight more than one enemy now. There are pretty large groups too.
Yeah, yeah, it
Uh,
can be a lot of it. It can fill the
yeah,
whole screen with slimes horizontally, if I recall. It can be a lot.
it really is, and they do like circumvent, not circumvent. They do give you abilities that can attack multiple enemies at once, so you don't feel like it's completely unfair. Um, the world in this game is significantly larger than the first one. In fact, there is like a shrunken, smaller version of the world map of the first game that is used to kind of fit inside this one, but it's pretty well done. Like it like yes, there's less towns and yes, there's a little less less land area per se, but they do a good job of not making you really feel like they took too much away, which I thought was kind of
Right.
cool. Uh, and here's another big one. Now, since I played the Super Famicom version, I didn't have this issue, but this is an NES specific upgrade. You didn't have to use menu commands to climb stairs. In the original Dragon Quest, you
Yes.
had to constantly select go into the menu to tell your character to climb stairs when you were next to stairs. In the Super Famicom versions and also in Dragon Quest 2, you can just walk onto a stair like every other RPG and you'll automatically climb. You don't have to use a command to input to climb stairs, which is just
You s-
bonkers to me.
you still have to select talk to talk though, I think, right?
I don't
But
know
it's
about I would assume so, yes.
talk is the
And
default though, so it's not that big of a deal. It's basically just a double tap.
I would assume so that that is the thing in the
I
NES and
think I could
Famicom
be
version.
wrong. You know, they,
Because
they do they do introduce those niceties to the series over time, and I forget exactly what the threshold of which game moved forward with
well, I can tell
the
you the Super Famicom port, all you have to do I mean, I plugged my PS4 controller in to play it on the emulator. You just hit triangle and it whatever is you're expected to do. Like if there's a chest, you hit triangle and it opens. If there's a door, you hit triangle, it opens.
Oh yeah,
Um,
I think they add some shortcuts on like L and R in some games too. Yeah, yeah, that sounds
they
familiar.
did it at least in the version I played. Like it knew what you needed to do if it depending on what item was next to you. So if you're talking to someone, then you're talking. If it's a blank area, you could just search it. You could just randomly search it and hope that you find a hidden item. Which there are hidden items strewn throughout this, which I didn't find much in this first in Dragon Quest 2. I found a lot in Dragon Quest 3, but I also used a guide a lot more for Dragon Quest 3, so that would probably be why.
Right, right.
The soundtrack in this game is significantly more varied, which we'll go into in a little bit. There's also a lot more monster variety. According to a lot of this info I got from the Good Vibes Gaming YouTube channel, they mentioned there was 13 unique monsters in the first game, not including the bosses, compared to 35 in Dragon Quest 2.
Wow.
Yeah, 35. You can also save in almost every town as opposed to in the original game, which is just the main castle, which I actually
Yeah,
did not hate. That's the jank I was expecting in the first game. The
yeah.
second one, uh, I was like, oh man, you can save anywhere? That is so convenient compared to having to constantly back
Well,
travel.
not anywhere, but yeah, and Any
Yes.
town, any town that has an is it at the end that you save or the church?
I think it's the church from what I remember.
Okay.
Yeah, you could save I believe you could save at the church. Or maybe there was like I'm blanking.
Eventually,
There was
church became the standard, but I believe in
yeah.
some games, it's the earlier games, I think it's the end.
Yeah, it's not they're not one and the same in this game because I remember in the final area you go to like this shrine where the guy does both, and normally that's not the case because in this game you need a priest to resurrect your dead
Right.
characters, and
Right.
the priests don't always save the game. There's like a town scryer that you talk to, and you can save your file on the Imperial Scrolls of Honor, as they call it. Yeah, let me just see if there's
Now,
anything else.
one more change related to monster variety and multiple monsters in battle. Um, the Super Famicom version is nice because you've got these, pretty backgrounds for your battles. That was the one downgrade on the
Yes.
original NES and Famicom was that you did actually have, I think, really attractive backgrounds for battles in Dragon Warrior 1, especially on the
Mhm.
overworld. I love just just this small window, but it's this really dynamic landscape where the singular monster appears. And I love the way that it, like, draws in like in a swirl, a tile swirl as the window opens up with the battle. I really like it, but uh, I don't know exactly the specific technical reasons, but presumably due to having more monsters and stuff like that, you just have a plain black background in Dragon Quest 2, 3, and 4 on the NES, which is a little sad. Although I will say the final boss in 4, I've actually never finished the NES version of 4, but I have finished it on DS. And I won't spoil anything, but the final boss is like freaking awesome. Like, probably the coolest final boss in the series.
Mhm.
And when I like saw like all the cool uh parts, the different phases of the boss, and like these like cool interstitial animations, I was like, oh man, like there's no, like, I wonder like how reimagined this was for the DS version, which is based on the Japanese PS1 version. I was like, there's no way the NES version looks anything like this. And then I'll look up a video of the final boss on the NES version, and it's like not as far off as you would think.
Huh.
It looks shockingly awesome for NES, like considering all the limitations of the visuals in the 2, 3, and 4 battle screens. The NES final boss still kind of rules in Dragon Quest 4. That's all I'll say. But yes, that does not apply to this game. It's just plain backgrounds, but the gameplay is still there. The gameplay is improved. It's just a slight visual downgrade, kind of much like, I suppose, Fantasy Star 1 to 2. Fantasy Star 1 had also very beautiful, colorful backgrounds based on the landscape that you're in, and really cool, like, fake 3D dungeons where the monsters would appear. And in Fantasy Star 2, you've just got this plain grid background pattern. It's got like a 3D element to it, but kind of a very similar downgrade. Yeah.
Hmm. The I think one of the reasons probably that contributed to that downgrade was this game had a really tight development window. The game began development a month before the first game launched. And
Wow.
yeah, like they really worked on this like quickly. This game released in 1987 or January 26th, 1987 in Japan on the Famicom. It was ported obviously a bunch of different places. It made it over to the MSX a year later in February of '88. Um, it also the North American version didn't come out until October 1990, And if you look at the release date for the original Dragon Quest, let me go find it real quick. But the original Dragon Quest came out on May 27th, 1986. So if you think about it, it came out literally less than a calendar year after the initial launch of the first game. First game in Japan, May 27th, 86. Second game, January 26th, 1987. So that's what, 9 months?
Yeah, wow.
No, less than that. That's like 8 months after the first game. That is bonkers to me that they would release it so quickly. And even though that was a really quick development period, they crammed so much into this game. I think that's what's more impressive about this game more than anything is that they crammed a lot into it. And what's even more bonkers is that we mentioned before how like the final like quarter of this game is pretty fucking brutal in terms of difficulty.
Mhm.
That was it was worse initially. The difficulty was worse until they were getting ready to release it, and then they saw how unfair and ridiculous it was. I don't remember all the specifics as to what it was, but go check out Good Vibes Gaming video on this. It actually came out at the time we're recording this a month or two ago, a few months ago. Um, but they go into some of the specifics as to like how broken the difficulty was. So they delayed the game for a month. So when you see that 8 months or 9 months of development time between, the month before the first game launched and then the first game launched and then 8 months later the second game came out. So this game came out in 9 months, which means the first eight was just all making the game, and the last
Yeah.
ninth month was
And
just fine
at
tuning it.
some point, I don't know exactly when, but at some point, someone was working on the American version of one. I don't remember exactly when it came out. Probably after two, if not after three, I bet. But I would imagine some of the original staff had something to do with that version, since they did rework the characters and stuff quite significantly. So yeah, pretty breakneck pace.
Yeah, it was crazy fast. And you mentioned before you weren't quite sure when they started coming out in North America. Dragon Warrior 1 came out in 89. It was August of 89 in North America, while Dragon Quest 4 came out in February 11th, 1990 in Japan. So it
So all they were almost completely done on the NES when those started
yep.
coming out.
They were, I mean, if you think about it, when the first game launched here in North America, they were working on four. They had already released
Yeah.
two other games on this
I mean,
for in the series, excuse
I,
me.
I think it's a miracle that all four came out in the US. I mean, it kind of blows my mind,
Yeah.
really, when you think about what happened to Final Fantasy, when you think about just how RPGs were not that popular or well understood by American console gamers at the time. It blows my mind that all four came out. It I'm really grateful that that happened.
It really is crazy to think about because RPGs, as I mean, for those who don't know, back on the NES era, like let's take out any console limitations. RPGs did not sell in North America, straight up. Like at least on the console, there was obviously popular RPGs on PCs. Wizardry, Ultima, which came out a good number of years before, which was also what these games were based off of. But RPGs on home consoles, that was not really a huge thing. There's a reason why so many people's like first RPG they remember is Final Fantasy VII, mine included. It's because that was the one that really broke through into the mainstream. And
Yeah.
not to say that there weren't other RPGs beforehand that
Yeah,
were
and
were
it was a
popular or
different
good.
ball
There's
game when you consider
yeah.
Western RPGs on PCs.
Oh yeah, it's a totally different ballgame. There's tons that were coming out that were popular, but they were limited to the PC crowd, which PCs were very expensive, and so not a lot of people could get. Versus home consoles were a lot more affordable. So it is crazy knowing that context that like RPGs in North America just really weren't a thing on home consoles, not a big thing at the very least. That they released all four that they did. Final Fantasy didn't they there was three on the NES or the Famicom, and they only released the first one. They waited
Yep.
until the Super Nintendo to release the second one, which is just crazy. But those are just some of the differences. Like I said before, there's a lot more. I have one other written down where it's like you don't need the torch slash light spell anymore to illuminate the dungeons, which is nice. But that's more of a minor change, just something I wanted to bring up, or just a minor thing to bring up. Uh, One of the things I thought was kind of cool is that Yuji Horii was surprisingly forthright in sharing the behind the scenes, even like when the game was still being in development. Like in his Famicom Sushin like magazine, he wrote an article and went into great detail how like memory was used in the game, like how they
Wow.
program stuff. They used memory mappers to contain everything into the cartridge, and they had lots of meanings on how they were going to allocate the memory needed, and it was used to keep track of stats, experience, gold, and that kind of stuff. Um,
Wow.
th-
Well,
yeah, it's kind of cool.
there's also a lot of pretty interesting behind the scenes scans in so there in Japan only there was a collection on the Wii for the I believe 25th anniversary of the series. I think it's just I think the title of the collection is literally just Famicom and Super Famicom Dragon Quest 1, 2, 3.
Mm,
That's literally the name of the collection. And it's not a great collection because, the Wii could do 240p through the virtual console. These games were not on the virtual console, even in Japan. So you were getting a unique product, but they're just 480i. So visually they aren't, and they're rather dark, so visually they're not great emulations. But there is a pretty nice set of behind the scenes materials to peruse. You've got, considering it is the Wii, even still, it's like relatively high resolution scans of the boxes and manual art and quite a few behind the scenes things. Like, I do believe, if I recall correctly, there are like some sheets that are like literally like, graph paper showing like how the memory blocks are used and
hmm
mapped out and all sorts of stuff like that. So yeah, you're right. They have actually preserved and shared a surprising amount of that kind of stuff. They've been pretty
hmm
forthright, as you said.
It. I wish would have had more time to do more research and really dive deep on some of the stuff they shared. But with all the stuff I've been prepping for Toriyama month and everything, I didn't get to go into it as much as I would have liked. But it's cool that it exists, and it's especially like I think they brought it up on I heard it was either on the Good Vibes Gaming video or it was somewhere else that Japanese devs didn't used to be so tight-lipped, but the reason we didn't know it back in the 80s and 90s because it was only ever to Japanese press and gaming magazines, so we
Mm,
would not have gotten any of that. So it doesn't surprise me knowing that little bit of history and that little bit of context because once things started getting more corporate, that's why it's good luck getting any interviews out of Japanese game devs now. Like
yeah.
that's Retronauts has talked about it a whole bunch where like they would desperately try to like sneak a few questions in about retro games if they were interviewing people at Nintendo and stuff like that,
Mm,
which I
mm.
thought was always kind of amusing. We've dabbled around. We talked about a lot of the differences in the gameplay. We should talk about the battle system specifically, like what they did in this one. We already mentioned there's you have three heroes now, as well as multiple enemy types. What they did with this, there was a lot of new different kinds of spells in this game. Some of them I can't fucking stand, especially when an enemy uses them. Things like defeat and sacrifice, those spells can go die in a ditch. I cannot stand it. The one point they brought up on the Good Vibes Gaming video, I'm sorry I keep shouting it out, but I want to make sure I give them credit so I'm not like stealing any of their points. But they brought this up and it's interesting watching that video. Their experience felt similar to my own, where like the first half was like really nice, and then the second half of the game was rough. And one of the things they brought up as well that I agreed with was basically what these two spells that I'm referring to, defeat and sacrifice are, is there ways to take out the enemy immediately. Defeat literally is like, think of it as like death in Final Fantasy. You know, if it connects, it kills the enemy instantly. Like no ifs, ands, or buts, just done. Sacrifice, you can use that as well, where you sacrifice yourself. A character can sacrifice themselves in order to take out an enemy or a group of enemies. The issue is that I think Rolando ends up, or the Prince of Canock, excuse me, is the one who ends up learning it. He's also the only one who learns a revival spell or
Oh
something like that.
no. Oh no.
So there's no point in actually like having him do that. Now, maybe my Super Famicom version was different. I'm going to actually Google the spells real quick just to
Yeah.
make sure
And
that
I
I have
honestly
everything.
can't really remember what the spell loadout was on the NES version, or if I even unlocked all the spells. I mean, it's, like I said, it's been a while. Um, in fact, I was surprised when you said like, "Oh, the Prince of Middenhall does not have any spells." I don't remember for sure if that was or was not the case in my version of the game. But I was just surprised because like some spells are pretty strongly associated with the main character of the game, across the series. Like, yeah, of course, the translations have changed over time and may not be the translated names of the spells that were in fan translation you played. But like spells like Zoom is like the travel to previously visited towns spell, and like that's always like a main hero spell, or almost always anyway. So I was like, oh
Mhm.
wow, I
So
did not
I
remember
do have the
that
list in
aspect.
I do have the list up in front of me, and the Good Vibes Gaming video was correct. The Prince of Canock learns revive at level 25, and the he also learns the sacrifice spell at level 28. So he's the only one that can do it. You can now, the Princess of Moonbrook does get a revive spell in a remake, not in the Super Famicom version, but like
Ah,
the remake later on. Um,
which is not good.
no, and she learns that at level 27. So it's this game has a lot of balancing issues, and we'll talk about why that is. Actually, well, we already alluded to it. It was the crunch. It was the fact that they did this game in 8 months, and they didn't have time to balance it the way that needed to. And we'll talk about the most notorious area of the game when we get to it.
Yes.
Uh, but yeah, there's tons and tons of spells. Like the thing that does get a little confusing is that there's like the version I play. So, for example, there's a spell called Surround, which always confused the shit out of me. It's basically confusion, is what it is. But Surround just makes no sense. Like the name Surround. And also, another version of it is called Dazzle.
Maybe
But
they make confound.
that might be what it is. But I mean, that's essentially what it is. Sometimes your enemy, if your character gets surrounded or gets confused, essentially, they won't attack themselves or their party members, but it'll just sometimes they'll. I think confound is a better term because they'll just kind of stand there, and be like, "Oh, I don't know what to do. I'm so
Yeah, yeah.
confounded."
I mean, the series as it goes on definitely plays around with that stuff in pretty amusing ways. Like there can be lots of really silly things, like variations on that. Like an enemy might do a dance, and especially in like the 3D games where you've actually got the characters animated, like the character just cannot resist the allure of the dance when they see the enemy dancing. They just like stand there just like acting like a fool, like just just busting a move, and it's it's pretty hilarious.
Man, that would have made Surround a lot more amusing in this game, but it I so hold on. I'm going to read off some of these other spells, right? So sacrifice and defeat I already mentioned, but I guess and this is the updated version of this. Um Sacrifice is later called kamikaze. Okay, that makes sense. Defeat is later called thwack. Really?
Yes.
Thwack. Like
Flat. Oh,
none of these.
Dragon Quest spell names get pretty silly. They there is they don't take in general, like I feel, especially in the NES days, I would say that I would the sense of humor didn't really come across in the translations. Um, but in the more modern translations, I mean, these are not games that take themselves very seriously. They have a lot of puns, a lot of alliteration, as you referred to with the title. There is a lot of silliness going on, really, in these games.
I think what bothers me more about the spell names is that they don't give you any idea of what the fuck the spell does. Like in the newer versions, like Fireball and Firebane, okay, that makes sense. Like though Firebane, I don't understand. Like I understand it's more powerful because it costs more mana and you or MP, excuse me, and you get it later. But
Well,
like in the
normally,
newer
like
versions, there's Sizz and Sizzle.
yeah, sizz, sizzle, kasizzle. Yeah, yeah, oh yeah, they go there.
Oh, that's
It's
amusing.
yeah, yeah. It is not a particularly self serious series, really.
No. Um, Another thing about the gameplay we can go into to talk about combat is how items work in this game. This um, so the first game you have a limited number of inventory space, and that wasn't awful because you're only one character, and a lot of it could be circumvented because you get spells that one like the wing of wyverns that you would use to transport back to the castle to save. You would end up getting a return spell, and it would just take you back to the castle. So that like you would end up getting spells that would circumvent the need for items, which then you could use for other items in battle, like healing and all that other stuff, or anything else you may need. So that was cool. In this game, it's similar in the sense that like there's a limited amount of inventory space, but each character has their own inventory. So if one character runs out of healing herbs and doesn't have any others, that character cannot use any healing herbs, even if your other characters have them equipped to them. So you could have like 20 heal, or not that many. You could have 5 more healing herbs on the Princess of Moonbrook, but that doesn't mean the Prince of Cannock or the Prince of Maidenhall are actually able to utilize those healing things. And I guess you
Right.
know what, real quick, just because I just for those who don't know, we keep referencing the names. Maidenhall, Cannock, and Moonbrook are all different like countries and locations. Hence what we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, where the hero, with together with his young bride, left on a journey to build several new countries. Well,
Yes.
Cannock, Moonbrook, and Maidenhall are some of these new countries. Um,
And those are where
and
your
so
characters are from.
and they're all cousins. And can
They're
we
all
talk real
royalty.
quick? Just real quick. I am getting a little sidetracked from the item thing. Can we just talk real quick how obnoxious it is to get the Prince of Cannock in your party and the Princess of Moonbrook? I did not enjoy either of that. So do you remember what you have to do to get the prince, at least the Prince of Cannock in? Do you remember what all the steps are for that? Because I do,
N-
but
Not
I want to. Did you feel
offhand.
the same frustration I did?
I remember getting him first,
Yes.
but that's
So
about all I remember.
So what happens is, all the shit happens at Moonbrook where the princess watches her father get burned alive. The guard fucking runs from Moonbrook all the way to Maidenhall, which by the way, unless he goes through an underground tunnel, and that's a long fucking walk. No wonder he died when he got to
Yeah,
the
he
end there.
sure did.
That is a no wonder he died there. But you're instructed to go meet with your cousins, the Prince of Cannock and the Princess of Moonbrook. Cannock, you're told, is to the north. So you walk north, you find a town, not Cannock, but you find another town, and he's not there. So then you go up, you make your way up to the castle of Cannock, and the king's like, "Ah, you just missed him. He went over to this cave over on the right hand side of the continent. I forget the name of the cave, but it's a cave. You go to the cave and there's an old man in there who's like, "Oh, that guy? Oh, he just left. He says he was going south to Maidenhall." I'm like, "God damn it, that's just where I was." So then you go down to Maidenhall, back to Maidenhall, and the king's like, "Yeah, he was here and he just went to go find you. He's going back up north now." I'm like, "You son of a bitch, just stay in one goddamn place." So then you have to go back up, and he's resting in an inn in that tiny town, not his home castle, which would make too much fucking sense. Like, I went back up to Cannock. I'm like, "So you made me do a goddamn like mouse chase. Okay, Whatever. I go up to Cannock and he's still not there. The king's like, yeah, the Prince of Cannock is still out and about. He went over to that cave over there earlier. I'm like, God, I was already there. Where am I supposed to go? And that's when I looked it up, where he's like in the town that you've already passed. And I
That is a little confusing for sure.
I hate that so much, just because, like, listen, I don't mind if you're going to give me specific directions. Let me put it this way: I don't mind a game that makes you wander a little bit, but if you're going to give me specific directions and you tell me he's going back home to Cannock, so he's going back north, or at the very least going north, you, eh, I already had to go north earlier to get to Cannock. He's clearly returning home to Cannock. And what's more frustrating is that since he's in another town, if you go into the town, even when he's there, after you've done all the steps that you're supposed to, there's no guarantee you find him unless you go into the inn and talk to someone sleeping on a bed.
Yeah.
Like, it does at least
I mean,
illustrate.
it makes sense when you think about it. Like, of course he would stop there. That makes sense. But like, what are the chances that you thought of that?
And the fact that, like, you can explore there, like, you don't even know what this dude looks like. You don't know, like, he's not going to stick out, like, compared to everyone else. The only thing I can think of is that if you paid attention to how many people were staying in the inn, and when you go back there, you see one other person resting in the inn, and you're like, oh, okay, so that's the guy there. That's the only thing I can think of. But I did not enjoy that. The
Yeah,
Princess of
I agree.
Moonbrook,
That's not great.
the Princess of Moonbrook is more obtuse, because you have to get basically, she is cursed, and you have to get this special item in order to break the curse. And I forget even how you do it. Like, you have to it I can forgive a lot of the stuff in this early game, though, because it is all linear. Like, you can only get to the one spot in the continent, so there's only so few locations you can go. So theoretically, you just start talking to everyone until you figure out where the Prince of Cannock was, and in turn how to break the curse of Princess of Moonbrook. I think you end up needing, like, the Mirror of Ra in order to break the curse for her. Um, and I'm
A
gonna double
recurring
check. Yeah,
item in the series.
what? Sorry.
A recurring item in the series.
There's a lot of reoccurring. That's the one thing whenever I'm looking up stuff, and or when I was looking up a guide, they would always mention, like, I would click on an item when I was trying to find it, and on the wiki it'd be like, here's how it appears in Dragon Quest 2, here's how it appears in Dragon Quest 3, here's how it appears in Dragon Quest 4, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the thing is, though, they the hints to break through the curse is very little. You talk to a bunch of the villagers, and they mention how there is this uh this mirror of Ra, or this Ra's mirror that you can get, and it kind of gives its location a little bit. And let me see, the location is, or hold on, location is hinted at by the ghost of the king of Moonbrook. It can be found by searching a swamp tile. And so you have to just randomly search a swamp tile. You have to go around just searching shit. And I think
Now,
it's
to
even
be fair, I don't know if maybe they changed things up in the Super Famicom version of Dragon Quest One, but I remember, I want to say it was like somewhere in the Southwest, like one of the main like items of armor, like the helmet or something. I remember having to do some garbage like that, just like, oh, you search this particular tile, there it is.
in
And
one. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, maybe there was an in-game way to narrow down how and where to search, but I was not aware of it. And that I remember that being something I looked up in Dragon Warrior One. So I
So
mean,
that that
not to defend that kind of garbage, but uh, you know, Dragon Quest One did do something similar, but
it did.
to my recollection anyway, it was a long time ago.
No, you're right. The reason it didn't bother me is that they tell you exactly where it is, not tile per se, but they tell you it's in, like, a poison swamp area. And when you go to the poison swamp area where they tell you it's, like, to the south or something like that, um, it's like literally in the dead center of it. Like it's a perfect circle, like or a diamond or something, and it's in the dead center. So when you see this shape, it's like, well, it's got to be in the dead center if it's a specific item. The mirror of Ra is not in the middle of something. It's like a four square, like it's a four tile square uh of swamp. So you just have to, and on top of that, there's other swamp, like poisonous swamp stuff too. So you have to get the right one. This kind of leads me to my biggest beef overall with Dragon Quest 2 is just the sheer amount of specificity of items, needing to find them. The one point that I didn't even put together when I was playing it, like I was frustrated by this, but there's a moment in the game when we get to the second half, and I'll go into more detail, where you have to find one hidden item, and if you don't find this one hidden item, the entirety of the rest of the game is you can't beat the game. Like it is
Oh,
just impossible to beat the game. Um, and before I get into that, at the very least, we should close out the items, because otherwise, I'm about to go off on a tangent about like the stuff we've been talking about with the how the game kind of paces out its challenges and whatnot. Um, the items I already touched on it. I don't know actually if I have much more to say. Your characters can only hold a certain amount of items, and your equipment counts as one of those item slots. So there is that risk reward of like, do you want to be a little bit under equipped but you can hold more items, which I don't think makes any sense, like, especially in this game. Like you need to be have as much defense as possible, because
yeah.
this game will mess you up.
There is also, I don't recall if this happens in Dragon Quest 2, but there is a common thing in the series where certain pieces of equipment will have special functions that if you use them as an item, like if you're in battle and you go into the item menu, you might think like, oh, well, I'm not going to select my equipment, I'm not going to use my equipment. But sometimes certain, maybe a rod or a shield or something like that might have a special thing where you can just cast a fireball spell for free, or it
Yeah,
does some sort of heal or something. I don't remember if Dragon Quest 2 does that, but it is a common thing in the series, and it's a mechanic that I often forget about. I'm like, I'll equip a piece of item, I'm not even paying attention that it has a little description of the text or something that says like, oh, if you use it in battle, it does this. So stuff. I mean, I've even like in some games, I've even kept certain rods in people's inventory, um, even if it wasn't like the rod that they were using, just because it's a free use of a useful spell uh, during battle. So, but yeah, I don't know if Dragon Quest 2 does that or not. I can't remember.
I don't know if Dragon Quest 2 does. I know 3 does, because I was looking up a guide for something, and I'll get to that obviously when I cover Dragon Quest 3 next week. But no, that they do. I wouldn't be surprised if there's stuff like that here in 2. I just don't know off the top of my head. But I want to now. We've talked about the different spells. We've talked about how the changes to the combat. A lot of different enemies. And actually, one last thing about the combat. We mentioned it in passing, but there is groups to enemies, and there are spells that you can use where if there's like a group of, let's say, 5 slimes, you can you can use a magic spell that does like that'll damage all of those. But if it's, say, there's a group of only one enemy, like, how can I describe this? Say there's a total of 6 enemies on the screen. 5 of them are slimes, one of them is an orc, right? Or some other enemy.
Yeah.
The 5 slimes will be grouped together, and the orc will be by itself. If you use like one of your attack all spells, like something that'll attack everything, or there's a bunch of different kinds of spells, I guess, but like the Firebane one, right? That'll attack every enemy in a group. Since that orc is by itself in a group, it will only hit that orc and not the other 5 slimes. If you use that Firebane spell, which hits every enemy in a group, it'll hit all 5 slimes. So the reason for that is because in this game, if you kill an enemy before say you cast fire on it, and some other character kills that enemy before you have a chance to cast fire, then you lose the MP and the spell never gets cast because it's an old JRPG. There was no like reallocation of
Yeah.
targeting.
Yeah.
Um,
Final Fantasy is guilty of this on NES as
yes.
well.
I That doesn't bother me. That's to me, that's a product of the time. It's old JRPG jank. I think it's bad, but like I'm not going to give this game a lesser score because of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It doesn't negatively impact my view of it.
yeah, we moved on to I think objectively better system, but
Yes.
I mean there is an element of strategy to it where it
Hmm.
does like discourage you from perhaps just like targeting one enemy until it's dead. Like you might be like, well, let's spread our attacks out because I don't want to waste an attack on an enemy that might end up being dead by the time my character gets around to it or something like that.
At least with the
But
physical
yeah.
attacks in this, they will automatically target the next enemy. It's just magic spells that don't.
Oh,
And
just magic. Interesting.
I'm
Interesting.
not, which is interesting, right?
Yeah,
It's odd.
the whole group thing definitely took a little getting used to when I was, really getting into the series. I wasn't real sure. Like it was confusing at first because not only can you have like again, I don't remember specifically if this applies to Dragon Quest 2, but oftentimes you'll see something like, okay, there you might have five slimes and an orc. Well, those five slimes might be a group, or there might be a group of three slimes and a group of two slimes. If you do a group spell,
Yeah.
you attack the group of three or the group of two. They not all enemy types are in the same group, which is a little bit annoying. But
Yeah,
does two
no.
do that?
Yeah, just what? Sorry.
Does two do it that way, where
Yeah,
sometimes
no,
like
they've
enemies
done it.
would be
They
in
do
two
it that
different
way as
groups?
well.
Okay.
It does take some getting used to, but the reason they have those groups is to mitigate that issue of spells missing. So if there's like three slimes, like you mentioned, and the other two characters take out two of the three slimes, the person who cast the spell isn't going to miss. It's still going to hit the last slime in the
Ah,
group. So it is a
ah.
way to circumvent that issue,
That makes
but
sense, yeah.
even so, it's still a little bit wonky. Like I won't say it's bad. It's just a little
It's a little
silly.
strange. It's not
Yeah.
quite what we're used to now. I don't think they divide enemies weirdly like that in the the recent
At
games,
least
but
in 3 they do, but it's also, I
well,
haven't played anything past 3, so
yeah,
I'll find
I
out
would
how it
say
does later on.
it's probably like that in most games, but I feel like targeting an 11 doesn't work that way, but I
I
can't
would hope
remember for
so.
sure.
I
Yeah.
would hope so.
Well, it definitely like yeah, yes. If a group is dead, it's not like your spells will just misfire. That's gone. That's gone for sure. But like I don't remember if it might be like, okay, here's slimes and these are in a group and these are in a different group. Like I don't think 11 does that. I think they did away with that at some point, but I might be mistaken.
Hmm. I think there was something else I wanted to bring up with the combat with how, like, the spells work and you can but I don't think I remember what it is anymore. So I don't know if I have anything more to add. I know we've been jumping around a little bit because one thing will remind me of something. I'm like, oh yeah, we didn't touch on that when we talked about this. So I apologize for jumping around a little bit, listeners. But yeah, the back to what I was talking about with kind of like the pacing of this game, right? What I liked about this game from the beginning is, I talked about my issues with getting the Prince of Cannock and how that's all confusing. Things that I like though is that even though that's a little confusing, there was a lot of things that I felt like I could have figured out if I just would have played the game the way it's kind of intended to, with, taking your time, exploring through the towns, talking to everyone. And ultimately that's what ruined my playthrough of 3 and why it's been so hard for me to finish, is because I'm using a guide. And that actually, like, I can't believe I'm saying this. I think a guide makes the game worse after what you were saying before, Try,
Yeah.
because
Oh yeah. I mean,
now, like, I still have issues with how it's paced, but not having a guide or using a guide ruins it because you're supposed to take your time and explore in this.
yeah. I mean,
And I wouldn't.
I felt like three even more so than two was very manageable without looking anything up. Uh, I, I, I,
I
I was showing you last night, like I dug up my old notes that I wrote by hand when I was playing the game, and especially with three, I found to be a very fulfilling experience. I mean, three is pretty top tier. Like, don't get me wrong, I like two a lot, but I think three and four are even better among the NES era games.
I'm gonna hold my thoughts on three because I do have something to kind of respond to that, but I want to save it for the next week's episode. At least in terms of two, here's where my issue with two begins. The game is linear up until a point. You get Prince of Cadoc, Princess of Maiden, or Princess of Moonbrook, and if you look at like the world map, like you start on the north, south, east side of the continent. I had to double check it real quick. You start on the east side of it, where Maidenhall is. It's the easternmost continent, the big continent, and then you travel north and northwest to get to Cannock, and then you go through this undersea tunnel to get to another continent, which makes you travel south, and that's where Moonbrook is, and then you kind of travel along this like big like U shape. Like this continent is huge. There's in between like the U shape, like the if you think of like the letter U, there's another continent in that empty space between the two sides of the U, and that's Alfgard from the first game. That's the continent from the first game, which is really cool. The setup to this game I liked so much. Like the descendants of the heroes of the first game, regardless of how logistically possible that is. You play as the descendants of them. You are following a similar trajectory of the hero of Erdrick because you need to stop this Hargon dude. You gather a group of people. You go to fight them. In order to fight him. But my issue is that if you kind of see how it travels, you travel up north, then west, then back south, then more west, and then back up north until you reach. Hold on, I have the map up in front of me. You reach the town of Hamlin, which is pretty far northwest, and that's where you get the boat. This is the first time in the series that you have something where you can travel off of the continent, right? Like you can go explore the world as opposed to just the one continent that you're on. And my issue with that was like I guess I just didn't do what you did try where you talk to everyone to find hints. Even if I would have found that, right? I think my main issue is that they want you to then aimlessly wander until you find other, well, not aimlessly, wander with a purpose. You're wandering with a purpose to find other towns so you can talk to the people in those towns and get other hints as to what you need to do. The only thing I can give it credit for is after you get the boat, if you go immediately to Alfgard, which the people in the town of Hamlin tell you is right next door, you can go to the old castle where the Dragon Lord from the first game was, and you find his grandson there. Once again, lending credence to my theory that these cousins are only grandchildren of the original heroes, not that far removed, but these kingdoms really sprung up quickly in 100 years. Um, and he tells you that the way to defeat Hargon, because he wants Hargon gone as well, because he wants to do evil things, and Hargon's in his way. You have to collect, oh my gosh, what is it? Like 5 crests in order to get the Eye of Malroth or something like that. I'm blank. There's like, I hate this, dude. I can't stand, like, it's all like proper nouns for shit that I don't even understand what's going on with. Like, what the fuck is the Eye of Malroth? Why does it matter to me? I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me. But you have to get the Eye of Malroth, and then I'm going to double check what the actual items are, just so that way I can at least say the right things. I'm not getting the things out of order. Okay. So the thing that I mentioned before about how like that one random item in a shop, like this is just indicative of my issue with the game. You get a jailer's key by going to the town of Burrowell and talking to to a shopkeep there. And the only way you know to do this is because you're wandering around the world aimlessly, well, with a purpose, like I said before. And you hope that a villager is going to tell you the right thing, or they all tell you the right thing, but you have to find the right villager to tell you. There is a blank item spot on this shopkeep's list, and if you select it, he charges you 2,000 gold or 1,500 gold or something like that for the jailer's key. You then take the jailer's key and you go to a jail cell in that same town, and you find a thief in one of the cells, and he gives you the Watergate key, which is the Watergate key is a key to a completely different town, which if you did not explore, you wouldn't know to use it for that. If you don't find it, you wouldn't know to use it for that. And this town is actually really hard to get to. It's like pretty far inland. I think it's the town of Sluice or something like that. It's pretty far inland. And so then you use the Watergate key there, which then raises the tide. So that way you can get to the moon tower. In the moon tower, you get the moon shard, which allows you to raise tides for shallow rocks in other locations around the world, which you need in order to gain entry to the sea cave. And inside the sea cave is where you get one of the five sigils, which the five sigils is what the dragon lord's grandson was telling you about in the first part. And actually, I'm sorry, in this sea cave is where you get that whole. It's the wiki listed as a false idol. I thought it was the Eye of Maldroth or something like that, but you need that in order to gain access to the final area. Anyway, you get the five sigils. And actually, to get to the fifth sigil, you need the Eye of Maldroth or the false idol, or Malroth, excuse me. You need the false idol from the sea cave to get the fifth sigil, which is in the cave to Roan, which is right before the. There's so many proper nouns. This is why I'm so mad about this try. It's all over the damn place. It's not intuitive. It relies on you talking to a bunch of villagers, and a bunch of NPCs in towns all over the world, which take forever to get because there's random battles everywhere, and I can't stand it, man. I can't stand it. I tried to list all of it, and I don't know how I'm going to edit this. This is going to be one of the most tricky editing jobs I've ever done because I tried doing it once before, and then I literally was like, "Stop, let me start over." And I don't know how I'm going to edit this all in, and then I still fucked it up because it's so damn confusing. I
Well,
I cannot stand this section.
I mean, I feel like I mean when you list it out all that way, I'm like second guessing myself. I'm kind of like, man, like I wonder if I looked up more stuff than I thought I did. Because like, you mentioned the Rubis thing. Like I remember I have a vague memory of looking up something related to finding the Rubis, whatever it was. And I know that I looked up how to get through the last final, the big cave. And so I looked up a few details after that point. Those are the details I remember looking up. But I think, you list out everything linearly. You look up a set of steps, like what are the required steps to beat this game. And I do find that when you do give in and look up something about a game, the knee-jerk reaction I have is, well, I never would have figured that out. How was I supposed to know? you know? Uh
Yeah,
but then sometimes I stop and think like, well, maybe I would have figured it out eventually, but like in this moment, it feels like it would have been impossible to figure it out. And I think for me, I approached the game less in a sense of, you know, okay, all right, what's this first step? What do I got to do? Okay, I've done that. What's the next step? All right, I've done that. What's the next step? And I wasn't approaching this game that way. I was uh, gathering information in a free form way from NPCs. I was very engaged to speak with the NPCs in the NES Dragon Quest games because they actually do drop that useful information. Um, and I found that over the course of the game, like if I was like, okay, I don't have any ideas for what to do, I open up my notes and I'm like, oh, I never investigated that. And then, I would go check that out and, oh, I couldn't do this before because I hadn't done this thing, but now I can do it. And so it didn't bother me that like I came across something that was like, oh, well, I came here, this NPC talked about this place and I'm here, but I don't think I can do anything right now. I just was like, well, I guess I can't do anything, but I would open up my notebook again. I'd be like, well, here's some other things I haven't investigated yet. I guess I'll pursue one of those. So instead of thinking of it as linear steps, I just, over time, over the course of the game, I finished marking off all of the things to investigate, and some of those opened up possibilities on some of the remaining ones that I hadn't investigated. I took the game very non-linearly, and I think that approach made me naturally come across the information that I needed. And I wasn't in a particular rush or hurry to get through the game, so I wasn't like, you know, I wasn't like, okay, what's the shortest number of steps to get through this. So it I but yet I will also concede it's so hard though. Like games these days condition us to think, I think, that
Well,
the information should be readily available. It should just be recorded for you. That it should be very clear what to do next, what to do, what to do.
well,
So yeah, it is. I admit, like playing it that way is absolutely not for everyone. It might not be for me today because it's it is hard.
I think,
I had a lot
well,
less going on outside of work
yeah.
back then, so I took my time with the game. Today, I might be similarly frustrated trying to approach it that way, but I'm glad that
And
I did do it at that time.
well, and I think I agree with you, and I also think there's a little bit more to it than that in this. So, we were talking off mic about a game I've been absolutely obsessed with called Animal Well. That game also gives you similarly no information. It is very much reliant on you to explore and figure stuff out on your own. I think the reason it works in that game, like why that game has hooked me and this game made me so mad, is because of the amount of time it takes to do the thing the game is trying to get you to do. Like
Mm,
if Dragon Quest it wants me to talk to all the villagers and they want me to figure out where I need to go based off that. I have no issue with that. I genuinely don't. What I do have an issue with is that in order for me to find the next town, to find the next hint, it may take me 15 to 20 minutes just to get down to it because of the random battles thrown in. And
sure.
the flee mechanic, which we didn't really talk too much about, not like you really generally talk about fleeing in RPGs, like you just run away from the battle, right? Not in these games. The success rate of a flee is like really low. Like especially in 3, like there'll be times where I'll do 5 flee attempts and it's only on the 5th one that I finally do it. Like they really want you to fight your way through
Yeah.
through
I mean,
fights in
it's
it.
always a gamble to waste a turn on attempting to flee.
But it shouldn't take 6 attempts. You know what I mean? Like
No,
there,
no.
like you, it maybe one failure, maybe 2 if you're really unlucky. But the my I was thinking about this when I was playing it. Know what I honestly think would make this game significantly better, and they would have to do some rebalancing. Get rid of random encounters on the boat. When you're sailing around, increase the speed of the boat just a little bit and get rid of random encounters on the boat. When you're
I,
on
I,
when you are on the continent, keep them on.
I
You get into
yeah.
fights because you have to walk across the continent to get to some of these towns and explore some things. Now, obviously, with that amount of random battles taken out, you will have to do some rebalancing in terms of difficulty, which is totally fine in my opinion. But if they did that, I don't think I'd be nearly as cranky about it because then
I
I would start looking for everything and then I could talk to villagers. I would know general areas that 'cause the game does point you in directions. It does like, every single hint, like you said before, it's not a hint. That is where you need to go. That is telling you exactly what you need to do and giving you gentle nudges. And I wouldn't mind those. I wouldn't mind that. I wouldn't mind this like linear and then all of a sudden it's open world approach if it wasn't for the fact that it makes it so tedious just to do the thing that the game wants you to do. They almost they almost punish you for exploration by making you go into random battle after random battle after random battle. And by the time like you're done exploring, the enemies are so trivial because you're such a high level that it's just boring. You're just mindlessly button mashing, and once again, fleeing doesn't do shit. So I could not stand this section
Yeah.
where they condition you to do one thing for about 50% of the game, and then the second half of the game is a completely different thing.
It would be nice if they did the thing that the Earthbound does. If you've played
Yes,
Earthbound, where if you are overpowered for the enemy, it's just instant win. You don't even go into the battle screen. But I do agree with you that I have always been disappointed by random encounters when on a vehicle in a game. That my first RPGs were, well, sort of Final Fantasy. I guess I kind of had a bit of a weaving route there for a little bit, but a lot of my early RPGs were Final Fantasy, and I was, you know, brought up on the idea that if you're on a chocobo, then by gummit, we ain't got no random encounters. That is safe. You are safe. If
going
you
too
are
fast for them to catch you.
Yes, if you are on a vehicle or a mount of any kind, you are safe. And it has always annoyed me ever since then that vehicle does not always equal safety. Like, to me, that should be sacred. And even Final Fantasy has messed with that a little bit, like being in a lot more recent games, like you can be attacked while on a chocobo. Generally it's quite easy to avoid, and you don't have to get into the battles when you're on a chocobo, but it can happen. But that, to me, that was always like a sacred thing. Like, even Final Fantasy 11, if you're on a chocobo, they'll leave you alone. Now in 14 they won't, although it the fact that they aggro you while on a chocobo is very trivial. There's almost no way
Mm.
they would actually be able to catch you or harm you when you're on a chocobo. But yeah, like that was always like a sacred thing to me. Like, and it's always like, come on. I'm
And
always annoyed. I'm always annoyed by that. So I am with you there. I don't love boat encounters in Dragon Quest.
and I wouldn't even mind the boat encounters themselves if it wasn't for the fact that they make you wander. You have to just they don't give you any direction. They just say go out and talk to everybody. And there's a whole lot of the world that you have yet to explore. And that would be really cool and exciting if it wasn't for the prospect that like it's going to take me so goddamn long just to get to a new town, just so I can hope that there's a hint for the next thing I have to do. Um, and in Animal Well, the game I've been hooked on recently, there's no direction given to you. You don't understand anything that's happening. You don't understand like what you're supposed to do, but there is very little combat in the game, and because of that, because you're aimlessly wandering around, you're constantly exploring, and there's nothing slowing you down. Periodically, there might be some enemies. Periodically, there might be like a like a like a sudden, like, not boss, but like thing that'll pop out. I don't want to say anything just because I know you haven't played it. I don't want to spoil it for other people, but like that feels good because they're not impeding what they're trying to do. They're not punishing you for exploring. Versus in this, it feels very much like punishment. And random battles being a core element of old RPGs, that should never be a punishment. That should always just be, it doesn't have to be necessarily a joy, but you shouldn't be pissed off every time you get a random battle when you're trying to explore, and that's my issue with it. If they
That's fair.
remove the random counters from the boat specifically, it doesn't even have to be a vehicle, but just from however you want me to travel, just some way, or like tone it down, I think it would make it infinitely better.
That's fair. That's fair.
Let's talk about the last section of this game.
Yes,
Uh,
it's bad. I'll
yeah.
admit it's bad.
Oh my god. Some of the toughest enemies in the game. Like, so this last section is to get to Hargon. He lives in this place called Rhone, Rhone,
Way up in the
and
snowy north, if I recall.
it's it, it's snowy, but it's in the southern half of the world.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean,
it
if you go,
it's
if you get,
surrounded by a mountain range though. Like you're
yeah,
not wrong. Like it's like he's in an area that would have snow. It's just not north on the map, but it's like
okay.
it's north in terms of elevation for damn sure. Um, it's pretty high up there. But you, in order to get to him, you have to get that Eye of Maldroth, which is also called the False Ido, from that sea cave, which I already tried to explain that whole quest chain. It's or item chain quest, whatever. Then you go inside the cave to Rhone, which is also where you get the last sigil, which will allow you to get the Eye of Rubus, which you need in order to when you get into Rhone. It's the hardest area of the game. Thankfully, they do one thing that's at least pretty fair. There's a healer there that can both heal and save your game. So it is the optimal area to grind. If you are
But
stuck
well,
on the
yes.
final boss, you have the best area to grind, and you can also heal immediately.
But really before then, it's that cave that leads to
Yes.
the Rhone region. Like before you get to the actual snowy part, it's the cave that broke me. Because I remember like it was just the most confusing maze. Like the connections
Yeah.
between rooms didn't make sense. You could
Nope.
fall down. I think you can fall down pits. Am I remembering that
Yep,
correctly?
you can.
Uh
That's a trope. No, I shouldn't say a trope. That's a theme in Dragon Quest dungeons. There's lots of falling down in pits into other areas.
Yeah, well, it's not so much later games, I would say, but yeah, it was so confusing, so confounding, so large. I was just like, okay, I know I've looked up relatively little for this game, but I am done with this cave. I am not. I just want to be done with this cave. I don't want anything to do with it anymore. So I looked up a map on how to get out, and then yes, so yeah, that's the part, that cave, that huge cave before the snowy fields. That's what I consider to be the worst part of the game. But yes, you're right. Once you emerge into the snow, and there is that little shrine where you can then warp back out to some previous towns. You can talk to the guy. You can heal. You can save. Super easy grinding, but grinding nonetheless. Because once you're up there, like I say, if if you're exploring or at least attempting to get through a dungeon, even if you fail, like to me that's not grinding. It's only grinding when you're going in circles, but there's nothing else to do. You are at the end of the game. The only thing left to do is to raid Hargon's castle and beat him. Hargon's castle's pretty hard. There's tough monsters in there. You need to be a higher level. So there's nothing left to do in the game but beat him, but you're probably still not a high enough of a level. So, yes, you go in circles in the snowy fields for quite some time. Heal, save, repeat, repeat,
Mhm.
repeat. And then eventually you go in and kick his butt, and the world is saved. But yes, not a great conclusion to the game, but I found the experience up to that last big cave to be fulfilling for the most
For
part.
m and for me, like, where the game kind of takes a nosedive is in that once it turns open world for all the reasons that I stated, but in that last section, you can tell very much that's where they were not able to balance it. Like I
Yeah.
already mentioned before, they took a month, they delayed the game by a month in order to just completely rebalance stuff because it was so brokenly difficult. Like one of the things they did in the early game to address that is that you couldn't fight groups of enemies larger than 3 because they were throwing like groups of 6 or
Mm.
plus at you in that first segment right when you're level 1 and just trying to get your
Yeah.
feet underneath you. Like it was super brutal. My big beef with this area try is that all these enemies, I referenced it before, the defeat spell and the sacrifice spell. Fuck those spells. I hate them. They should not be in. I don't understand how it's a fair mechanic in the slightest. You
At the
can
least, though, Dragon Quest doesn't take away your experience when you game
No,
over.
but you lose half the money, which at that
You
point you
lose half your money.
probably won't need.
At that point, you won't need it, but yeah.
But the fact that, like, it's not the money for me that is the issue. It's the progress that you lose because the random encounter rate, as I've mentioned before, is a little high. It's a little frequent, and you can walk all the way over to Hargon's castle from the save point, from the healing save point, and then there will be an enemy that suddenly is like, I'm going to just choose sacrifice, and it kills all of your characters instantly.
Yeah.
It'll kill them as well, but it kills all your characters, not just one, all of them. At least defeat has a chance. It's like it plays it one by one, and it rolls the dice for each individual character. Sacrifice is fucking guaranteed, and it just completely wipes out your party. You lose the money, but if you didn't save prior, then it's a pain in the ass. So then you have to walk all the way back again, depending on the distance. It takes you back to your last save point, I should
Yeah. I
say.
mean, you can definitely end up, even once you're a good enough level to take on Hargon, just that walk from that last shrine save point, you can definitely end up in a poor state before you even get into the castle. So,
Exactly. And that was my biggest beef with the end because I didn't even think about the dungeon and the cave to roam. That I had a guide, so it didn't bother me at all. I could see how someone who doesn't have a guide, that dungeon is awful. It is like same with the sea cave. The sea cave is also hard, and very windy and mazy, and it's not, once again, it's not fun to explore. And if you're forcing the player to explore, do not make it difficult for them to do the mechanic that you want them to do. I'm not, if the mechanic, like exploration should not be a challenging mechanic. The only way that I think you could make that argument that it should is if it's like a platforming thing where it's like a technical skill, but just walking around the world trying to figure stuff out. And I don't know, I can't stand that. If you wanted me to have fight monsters, that's fine, but don't make it every like 5 seconds, I don't know.
well,
It
they were
re-
definitely still figuring out random encounters. And
yeah,
granted, you know, I think back then there was an expectation that, people would be, chewing on a game like this for maybe a couple of months,
I also
that,
think
that
that,
might be
yeah,
the only game that they buy for, a few months. And, nowadays we kind of expect to maybe move through certain games a little more quickly. So it's definitely a product of the time where, they wanted to occupy you for a while, and developers and publishers want to do that today. That's why they have, all this gotcha stuff and
games
season
as a service.
passes and stuff like that. Do your dailies in the game and all that stuff. They try to hook you. They want you to spend some time there to chew on it for a while. But they did it in different ways back then. And some of those ways were, JRPGs were in their infancy for sure.
Definitely, definitely. And I mean, I feel like I'm just going to keep harping on the same issues that I had. The defeat and sacrifice spells ruin that section for me. Like it's already hard enough as it is. But then you go and you fight, when you get to Hargon's castle, you have to use the Eye of Rubis, which dispels the illusion. There's an illusion there. Like, because when you go into it, all of a sudden you're back at Maidenhall, like the castle you started at. You can go to the inn, you can rest there, you can buy items. But once you dispel the illusion, all the items that you bought are gone and you never actually rested at the inn, which is a really cool touch. Like I
Wow.
think is actually legitimately like a cool touch. I really enjoyed that. And yeah, so you defeat Hargon. He's a difficult fight. That's totally fine by me. That it's meant to be. And this is something I do love about Dragon Quest games, that at least of the two I've played, and the bits I have not beaten three, but I'm assuming three does something similar. When you beat the game, when you beat the final boss, credits don't roll. You go back through a world that no longer has monsters,
Mm.
and you can talk to everyone. You can see the effects of what you did to the world around you. And I talked about it in the first Dragon Quest episode last week, and they do it again in this one. And since this world is bigger, there's lots more places for you to go to, and it's fun to go to because you're not getting stopped every 2 seconds. But you can see all the different things that they're saying, and like see the little story vignettes that you've kind of set up throughout the game, or that you've experienced throughout the game, kind of see their stories end. It's really cool. I like that type of thing. I think it's one of
Yeah.
the
The
coolest elements
little
of Dragon Quest.
the victory lap.
Yes, I love that. I love the idea of the victory lap. It just makes it that much more satisfying. And if the stories were a little bit more like involved, I guess, because like they like I said, they start off so strong with like, princess watching her father murdered by the evil Hargon, and but then there's not really any dialogue with anyone. They're just kind of there, and so they,
Yeah.
they have this really cool setup. And I don't necessarily am mad about it. It doesn't ruin the game for me. I understand this game came out in 1987 on the Famicom, so like there's only so much they could do with how big this game was. I mean, this game's, think about this. Well, I'm going to give this game a compliment. I've been shitting all over it for the last like 30 minutes or so. The world in this game, like the scope of this game, is insane considering they made this in less than a year after the first game,
Yeah.
and on the NES and on the Famicom. Like, it is bonkers to me that they were able to cram so much into a Famicom cartridge.
Yeah, I mean, and those monsters like alone, the significant increase in monster types took up a lot of memory. So yeah,
Well, something about the monster types too. Apparently, the orc designs for this became iconic in Japan. Like, we're used to, once again, like Toriyama, how he took the slime, like the D&D slime that we're all used to, with like the kind of acidic goo that you
yeah, yeah,
see.
I made it
Um,
cute.
Yep, and made it cute. This one with the orc, he took the orc, instead of this like green, creepy looking thing, he turned it almost into a pig. Like, it's very
Yeah,
pig
yeah.
like, and it's like you can even see those influences in like other video games as well. Like, I don't know when did the original Legend of Zelda come out? 80, no, when did the original Legend of Zelda come out? Can't come out.
86, I think, in Japan. I think
I was going to
86.
say, but Moblins changed to be more pig like later on, I believe.
I mean, they were always relatively pig-like, I would say.
Maybe. I'd be curious. I mean, they're pig like, obviously, they have been for quite some time. I don't know what they looked like in the original Zelda game. I'm going to have to. They looked more like a bulldog in the original Zelda game.
Yeah,
Um,
I could see that. I could see that actually. Yeah,
and
yeah.
actually, if you look at like a picture of a Moblin in like the Adventure of Link, I'm looking at the Zelda wiki right now. Like, it looks just like a bulldog. It's got the jowls and everything.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
I
as it
I
goes
see what
on,
you
it
mean.
becomes more pig like.
Yeah. Well, and those orcs, have continued on in Dragon Quest, and once one of those monster designs was established for a Dragon Quest monster, it never changes.
No, it
Never
makes sense.
changes. It's always exactly the same. They always have the same pose, and later on, of course, they add animations, to those poses, but like the same like
Mhm.
main pose. I get, all of those monsters immediately become iconic and are relatively unchanged. Of course, they do variants like like the slimes. Then you have slime puddles and slime towers and king slimes and stuff like that. You've got your variations, but like the basic version never changes. It becomes a
Mm.
classic.
I don't really have much more to add to Dragon Quest 2. I feel like we've covered all the things I wanted to cover. The issues that I had with the pacing, everything. You talked about what you liked, and I think I genuinely think, because I feel like took a lot of the conversation and just kind of to crap all over the issues I had with it. I will say, to kind of play devil's advocate with myself, to kind of push back on myself a bit. I don't think I played the game entirely the way it was meant to be played, which is how you played Try. Like, you took your time and you explored the world. I didn't have I I did have time that I could have taken more. Like I could have taken more time. Like I wasn't rushing. I mean, I was trying to get these episodes out in June, but when I was playing this, it was like March, you know, like I had plenty of time in order to do this. So it's not really, I don't even really have the excuse other than I was getting impatient. And I think there is an element of like, you have to play it the way the game was meant to be played. With that said, I still think the quest chain is a little unfair, just the hyper specificity of it. And also the final section, which we've already talked about. And you know what the quest chain kind of reminds me of? It's a similar criticism I have of the original Metroid game. I beat the original Metroid game for the first time, actually, like in December last year. I did use some save states, but uh, my big issue with the original Metroid is that in order to beat the game, like you have to, you know, defeat Ridley and Kraid, I want to say is
Yeah,
the,
Kraid, yeah.
yeah, I was about to say Krang. I'm like, this isn't TMNT. Uh, but to get to Ridley, you have to, you know, bomb one specific location on the far right portion of the map, which will open up a hidden tunnel that will open up access to the entire like last third of the map. So if you don't bomb that one specific thing, like I could understand having like a secret path to get to it a little bit earlier, or like it's a safer route if you take the time to explore. But to have like an essential part of the game be hidden behind a random block, and you can't beat the game until you do that, I think is just bad. And I think this game kind of does something similar where the entire question is contingent on you selecting the hidden item in a shop in Burrowell, which you have to know to go to Burrowell to do. You have to find Burrowell first. If you do not find that town and talk and find the right shopkeep and select the right blank space, none of that can happen. You don't even have a chance to figure out the rest. And I'm not a fan of obfuscating things for the sake of padding on a game, and that's what it feels like with this. That was
No,
my biggest
yeah, and
criticism with it.
yeah, for the sake of padding out or just obfuscating stuff for the sake of obfuscating it. I mean, you know, there is the I guess in theory like the social element of like, you know, kids on the playground or you know, whatever, like talking about like, oh, I found this, you know, it can be something to that, but it shouldn't be the only way to find it out or the only way to reasonably find it out. But, you know, funny enough, Metroid, when I was trying to find my Dragon Quest II notes, I found the map. My attempt at making a map for the original Metroid, which is also a game that similarly was afraid of. Thought I was not really going to like going back to the original in the series, you know, due to the lack of map and stuff. But like I came prepared with pen and paper and found myself enjoying it a heck of a lot more than I expected to. Although I honestly can't remember the extent to which I ended up looking anything up. You know, it's not nice when there is like just some block you have to bomb and there's no visual cue at all to make you think that. And there's certainly no NPCs who can give you that hint in Metroid either. So I don't remember what my approach was at that point, but in a lot of ways, a similar experience for me. A game that I went in with lower expectations, but came in, you know, ready to do it, quote unquote, the old fashioned way, and ended up enjoying myself a lot more than I thought I would.
I wish I could say the same for this one. I enjoyed the original Metroid a lot more than I thought I would, but with this, I had such high hopes for it because of my how much I enjoyed the first one. Actually, one last really funny story. I'm not. This is not a ding against the game. This is just something funny that happened to me. In my fan translation, there was a game breaking glitch. In the There's a town where they tell you about it. There's a random chance where one of your party members can get put under Hargon's spell and will sleep forever
I
unless
do
you can
remember something.
find.
I remember something about this now that you
Yep,
mentioned.
unless you find I can't even pronounce it. A leaf from the world tree, the Yggdrasil. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Um, and you have to bring that leaf back to them and wake them up. And they give you hints on how to find the tree of Yggdrasil and the leaf of the world tree and whatnot. But I would do that, and I would come back, and then it would get stuck in a text loop of just saying the same thing over and over and over again.
That
The
is
you
that a
your guy
fan
would wake.
translation specific issue?
I'm pretty sure.
I
I'm
think
90.
so.
I'm
I think I've heard about this. Yeah.
Yeah, I because I didn't have. I can't imagine that was in the original game. So I didn't knock anything for the game, but it did, or it. I didn't want to bring it up in the when we were like really talking about a lot of the specific issues with the game, just because it's not the game's fault that the fan translation had an issue. But I did find it did add a little bit of frustration on my part, and it was a little amusing after the fact, to say the least. But yeah, um, I think that's it, man. I think we've talked about everything we wanted to say. So try seriously. Thank you for joining me on this one, man. Hopefully, I didn't like completely ruin your nostalgia for this game.
No, 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 no,
It's
not at
it's
all.
uh,
Not at all.
one of the first games in a long while that I've covered on the show where I'm like, I honestly did not enjoy, and I'm bummed by that. So
Yeah. Oh,
uh,
I was bummed a little too because when you were like, "Man, I played Dragon Quest One and I loved it," and I was like, "Oh man, I mean, if you loved the first one, you're gonna love them all."
I I I
And
I
I think that just comes from me being in a place where
yeah.
I like the first game less than most Dragon Quest fans do.
Well, and I think really what it like comes down to is I admire this game's ambition and its setup. Like I really think they did they had all the right ideas, and it's just the execution of those ideas that I'm not a fan of. Like the you know adding more characters, adding more enemies, making the game world bigger, having a little bit more in depth of a story, all of those ideas, and allowing more exploration of the world, like all of that on paper would be good. It's just the way it's implemented just kind of ruins it for me. So like I wish I could like this game more because I do think it's impressive what they did, and it was a lot of firsts for the series. It just
Yeah.
ultimately didn't click with me, unfortunately. So
And
uh,
its story is I've not played through it myself, but the Dragon Quest Builders 2 is a direct like continuation of
yeah, I've
Dragon
heard
Quest
about that.
2's story. Yeah, to some extent. I think it takes place quite some time later, but I'm looking forward to playing through that. I liked the first Dragon Quest Builders quite a lot,
I
which
have
was
not played
based on the
either of
first
them.
Dragon Quest game.
I think the only other Dragon Quest game I own is I own a Dragon Quest Monsters game for the DS.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the monsters games are actually some that I have basically no experience with. I don't own any of them.
Maybe I'll give it a shot at some point. But in any case, let's wrap up this episode. Try once again, my friend. Thank you so much for joining me. This was a really fun conversation on Dragon Quest 2. So, of course, as usual, where can the good people find you online, and what would you like to promote?
Yeah, pretty much just find me on the YouTube channel, My Life in Gaming. We release videos when we release videos, and we also stream on the YouTube channel every Sunday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Josh was actually just on me just over a week ago on the Sunday night stream playing some 007 Nightfire, which was great. And I also stream on Monday nights on the Backloggery Twitch channel, usually 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. or so. Just trying to get through various games on our backlogs. A lot of co-op. A lot of sometimes we'll just try like this. Pick a NES game or something like that from our backlog and both try to get through it at the same time, and sort of help each other out, like, oh, I figured out that this worked really well on this boss, or you gotta go over here, So sometimes putting two heads together that might have been a great way to get through Dragon Quest too. Come to think of it, but yeah, we have a lot of fun with that streaming stuff. But yeah, I'm not really on social media or anything. Pretty much just that's about it.
All right. As usual for myself, you can follow me Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Twitch at Still Loading Pod on all of them. If you want to support the show, if you like what you've been hearing, you want to help the show grow, please consider giving it a 5-star rating or review on your favorite podcasting app. It helps more people find the show. If you want to support it monetarily, I got a bunch of goodies for you over at patreon.com/Still Loading Pod. For $1 a month, you get all the episodes a little bit earlier with better audio quality, along with patron voting rights, which helps choose future topics for the show. For $3 a month, you get everything at the previous tier, along with patron shoutouts, which you heard at the beginning of this episode. So if you'd like to get your name on that, on those patron shoutouts, you can sign up on this tier. For $4 a month, you get everything from the previous 2 tiers, plus access to 2 mini bonus episodes every month. And for $5 a month, you get everything, plus access to Still Bonding, which is my monthly James Bond podcast where me and a bunch of friends bond over 007. Try here has been on 2 episodes. He has been on Live and Let Die, and also I made him suffer through Die Another Day. So there we go. He's been on a number of those episodes. So that's all over at patreon.com/stillloadingpod. But yeah, that's it. That's all the time we got for you on this episode. Try. Thank you once again for joining me.
Pleasure as always.
And with all that said, listeners, I will see you all next time.